Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning, and this class is a really brief overview of highlights of things we learned in the Daf in the past week. And it's taught by a rotating cast of wonderful teachers. And this morning we are joined by Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. Go ahead.
All right. Good morning. Good morning for me. Good whatever time of day it is for you. I hope that your cheesecake or blintzes or whatever Shavuot delicacies you might be preparing, if you're getting ready to prepare Shavuot, are filling your house with sweet smells. We have a nice blintz.
We do pizza at my house.
Nice.
But please tell us in the comments what you're eating for Shavuot this weekend, whether it is cheese or rose water if you're Sephardi.
Oh yeah, there's lots of
good things you're eating. Make us all hungry.
Right. I have children who are vegetarians, so they love this holiday because their grandfather calls them cheesetarians because they like cheese. But anyways, that'll be for a different day. But anyways, Chag Sameach. We're gonna jump right in. We're gonna jump in by going back to Masechet Eruvin, and I'm gonna share a story from there, which has a connection to this week's learning, but I'm gonna keep it hidden. So I'm jumping back. I know I'm going to a different Masechet, but the connection will emerge. Want that, I guess, know that in advance. So I'm going to share my screen and start the slideshow. There we go. Excellent. All right. So in Masechet Eruvin, we read a famous story that is oft quoted that goes as follows. Rabbi Abba said that Shmuel said, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. There's not a lot of context to this text, so we don't know if they disagreed about something specific or they just disagreed about things, but we do know that Talmud has a tradition that, right, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were rival houses, and there are many discussions in the Talmud that involve a disagreement between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. These said the halacha is in accordance with our opinion, and these said the halacha is in accordance with our opinion. They each claimed that Jewish law followed them. And at the end of this 3-year disagreement about who should be followed, a divine voice, in the Hebrew it's a bat kol, emerged and proclaimed, both these and those are the words of the living God. However, the halacha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. So a divine voice rings out to settle this debate and says, actually, both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are the words of the living God, but we follow Beit Hillel. The text goes on to say we follow Beit Hillel. They earn that merit because in their academy, they taught the words of Beit Shammai. They taught Beit Shammai's opinion before they taught their own, meaning they included the opinion that they disagreed with in the discussion in their Beit Midrash. So they get the merit for the halacha following them. People talk about this text in lots of ways. One, in terms of voice for pluralism, in that we have lots of disagreements amongst the Jewish people, but a healthy attitude, says this text say. But regardless of who you follow, you should recognize that both these and those are the words of the living God. Right? Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hem is the Hebrew. If you've already read this week's text, you might already know the link to this week, because this phrase that I've highlighted here in yellow, both these and those are the words of the living God, that appears in this passage in Eruvin 13, and the only other time it appears in the Bavli outside of this Eruvin 13 was this week on Gittin 6b. And when something appears twice in a phrase like this, I have to think, and others too, that there's some literary connection between the two, that the stories are echoing each other. So I'd like to take a look at our context this week and to think about how it relates to what we know here from Eruvin, and maybe how it's different and what the messages are, to compare and contrast the two stories a little bit. So here we go. We're going to start with how we get into it with the context. Rabbi Eviatar sent a letter from Eretz Israel to Babylonia to Rav Chisda, in which he wrote the following. So Rabbi Eviatar was a sage in Eretz Israel, and he wrote to Rav Chisda, a sage in Babylonia. We know there was communication between the two communities. Rav Eviatar says, with regard to bills of divorce that came from there, meaning Babylonia, to here, meaning Eretz Israel, the agent, the delivery agent, is not required to say, it was written in my presence and it was signed in my presence. So if you know, a big topic of the opening pages of Masechet Gittin is about the fact that when a messenger delivers a get from far away to Eretz Israel, they have to declare that they witnessed the signing and the writing and the signing of the get. And some of that is because, right, an individual messenger is only one person and isn't sufficient to testify that it's a real divorce document. And the opening Mishnah of our Masechet requires that the agent make this declaration to help give some strength to this document that has traveled from overseas. And there's a discussion in the Talmud that says the rabbis in Babylonia are saying, well, Babylonia is the new Eretz Israel, right? A divorce document coming from here shouldn't need the same statement to affirm that it's required, or maybe it should, because the Mishnah says, right, anything traveling, needs that declaration. And so Rabbi Eviatar comes to say, actually, right, when he, in his practice, when he gets a bill of divorce from Babylonia, he doesn't require the agent to make the statement that the Mishnah talks about requiring the agent to make. So that's how we get into this ordeal. That's going to come back to the story because it centers around Rav Eviatar. But first, a little rabbinic lashon hara, a little, or maybe slander, or maybe defamation of character. Rav Yosef says, who will tell us that Rabbi Eviatar is a reliable authority? Rav Yosef comes and says, who's this Rabbi Eviatar guy? He might not be a reliable authority. Why should we accept his opinion about this? Furthermore, Rav Yosef has another reason to suggest maybe he's not a reliable authority. He's the one, this Rav Eviatar guy, once sent a letter to Rav Yehuda where he wrote, people who ascend from there, Babylonia, to here, Eretz Israel, right? The people who moved to Israel from the community in Babylonia, fulfill a verse from the book of Yoel, the prophet Yoel, and they have given a boy for a prostitute and sold a girl for wine and have drunk. It's a little, it's I guess a PG-13 or higher rated verse from Yoel, and it seems that what the furthermore statement is saying here, that Rav Eviatar is suggesting that those who abandon their families and come from Babylonia to Eretz Israel, those who go from Babylonia to Israel abandon their families and leave their children, as prostitutes in the street, or as if they exchange them for wine. Not very good to abandon your family and make aliyah, to leave your family from the community. But it's not the drash that gets him into trouble. He wrote this in a letter to Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yosef tells us when he wrote this verse, he didn't score the page. So this is a technical piece. The rabbis talk about when you write a biblical verse, you have to prepare the page that you're writing on, and the scoring of the page involves etching into the page these lines. Like, think about it as like college ruled line paper, just without the printed blue lines on it, but having those scratched in. And if you write a verse of the Torah of a sufficient length, of which this one is, you need to score the page if you're going to quote the Torah, right? Quote the Bible. So separate from the drash, right? Rav Yosef is suggesting Rav Eviatar is not a reliable person because he doesn't follow this tradition of scoring the page. Little tangential information there, but to summarize this little bit, Rav Eviatar gives an opinion. Rav Yosef raises questions about his opinion, but not based on the logic of the opinion itself, based upon the character of Rav Eviatar, and calls him personally into question. So then the Talmud comes back to defend Rav Eviatar, and he says, Rabbi Eviatar is one that his master, here meaning God, agreed with his interpretation of a verse. So the Talmud comes back and says Rav Eviatar is a reputable character. God's self, right, agreed with one of his interpretations of a verse concerning a story about the concubine in Giv'ah, Pilegesh Bagivah, from the book of Judges 19:2, and his concubine went away from him. We'll talk about this verse in a second. Just an aside. To get to this point that connects these two stories, I recognize there's a lot of tangential information here. Thus, we know that we know about the Talmud already by this point. 3 years in, you sometimes have to fill in a lot of backstory. But anyways, Rav Eviatar has an interpretation about this verse, which God's going to agree with. We'll talk about that in a second, but I'm going to click to this reference. Oh, hopefully it's going to load. There we go. Yeah. Judges 19, it's one of the hardest stories to read in the Tanakh. The book of Judges is often about how the people stray and a new leader rises up to bring them in. But the Judges 19 starts a story about a violent and devastating civil war between the tribes that begins with these two verses. Right in the days when there was no king, a Levite was residing at the other end of the hill country of Ephraim, and he took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem. And the concubine deserts him and leaves him for his father's house, and she stayed there for 4 months. If you read on, the Levite goes and get to try to reclaim the concubine from her father's house, and things deteriorate from there. If you want to read one of the hardest stories in the Bible to read because of the levels of violence and the destruction, and especially the fate of the concubine, Judges 19 is the reference. But enough for our context is to know this beginning of verse 2, the concubine gets up and deserts the Levite with whom she has been residing. And the rabbis ask, what was it? Why was it that she left? And here we have this discussion about what caused the concubine to leave. Rabbi Eviatar, that's our main character of this narrative flow here. He says he found her responsible for a fly. Oh, pardon the extra word. He found her responsible for a fly, and Rabbi Yochanan says he found her responsible for a hair. We'll see from later, it appears, well, the commentators suggest this could mean lots of different things. From a comment that will show up on the next slide or two, we'll see that this means potentially that the Levite blamed her for either a fly or hair that got into some food that she prepared for him and threw a fit about it. And I guess the anger or rage that he expressed in this fit about the fly or hair in his soup or porridge or whatever meal led her to get up and flee the house. And this is now what comes in. And so we have these two opinions. Rabbi Eviatar says one thing and Rabbi Yochanan says another. Rabbi Eviatar bumps into Eliyahu the prophet and says to him, Eliyahu, tell me what's God doing now? And we know from a number of stories, right? Eliyahu Navi in the Bible doesn't die. He goes up to heaven in a fiery chariot. And the rabbinic midrash, not just and later as well, we have many folk stories within rabbinic and later literature about Eliyahu Navi coming back and visiting Earth and interacting with people. One of the things that Elijah does in the Talmud a lot is he comes back and reports about what's going on in heaven. So Rabbi Eviatar bumps into Elijah and says, what's God up to these days? And Elijah says to him, well, God's engaged in studying the episode of the concubine in Giv'ah, which first of all, I think is this amazing image that, right, God's studying Torah. He's studying a story from the book of Shoftim. You might think, depending on your theology, right, for the rabbis' theology in particular, you would think, God knows the Tanakh, the Bible pretty well. Why does God study it? But Elijah reports God studying it. I love that concept. And Rabbi Eviatar says, well, what's God saying about it? And Elijah says to him, God says the following. Oh, sorry. Eviatar, my son, says this thing, and Yonatan, my son, says this other thing. And what does that mean? God seems to be in this dilemma. He's reading this story, and he knows that Rabbi Evyatar thinks that it's a fly, and Rabbi Yonatan thinks it's a hare. And God seems troubled by the fact that two of his children, two rabbinic scholars, have a different interpretation of the verse, and God seems distraught, almost that God doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to read the verse because two of his children have differing opinions about it. And Evyatar says to him, God forbid that there's uncertainty before heaven. How is it that God could be deliberating about this verse? God's supposed to know what the Bible means. And Elijah says to him, both these and those are the words of the living God. And continues saying, he, the Levite, found a fly in his food and did not take umbrage, and later found a hare and took umbrage. So how does this? So here's our phrase from that we see from that other story from Eruvin. Elijah says, well, actually, both midrashim, both interpretations are the living word of God. And actually, here this isn't meant potentially metaphorically, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But Elijah says, the reading of the verses, right? The Levite found a fly, it didn't upset him, and then he found a hare, and that was like the straw that broke the camel's back, and the rage emerged. That's the rest of the story. But both interpretations are the living words of God. And that's Elijah's report here. To close the loop about our context, this ends the story where the Gemara gives, there were some questions about Evyatar's status as a commentator because he didn't score a letter, and they're not sure he's a respected authority. This story comes to restore him and say, see, God says his words are part of the living word of God. He must be respected. What I love about this story in and of itself, besides we see God studying, we see this statement here, though, that when the rabbis come and interpret verses and bring different verses and bring different, interpretations, even about the small details, right? He found a fly in his soup. No, he found a hare in his soup. Right? God recognizes that both of these midrashim are the living words of God, or Elijah at least recognizes that. And there's this notion here that the discussion of Torah, the discussion of the Bible, the rabbis' opinions, no matter how big or small, are all part of this sacred piece, and they all represent the words of the living God. And I actually like that. Right, it's Divrei Elohim Chaim, right? The eternally living words of God, almost as if as Shavuot is approaching, and we think about reenacting the giving of the Torah at Sinai, they talk about in the rabbis, some midrashim, about how it wasn't just the written Torah, it was the oral Torah that was also given at Sinai, and the echoes of that Torah continue, so that any conversation between teachers and students about the Torah are echoes of that original revelation. And there's a hint of that in this discussion about, is it a fly, is it a hare, might not be so significant to the story, or it might not matter so much, but those details, even those, echo this living conversation between the two. And this debate, while maybe smaller than the debate between Hillel and Shammai, gets described the same way. A debate between two people about how to interpret a piece of scripture or how to put it into practice is the living words of God, and all the different opinions should be noted. And I like seeing that piece here. And I think it's an important thing to remember, whether the discussion is large or small, as we read the Talmud, which we know brings on every page differences of opinion about things both great and small, some that are talked about for pages, some that are mentioned and we move past really fast. Some differences are resolved where we choose to follow one and not the other, and some differences are not resolved. In the rabbi's mind, though, this whole discussion, the whole conversation, has some sacred content to it. Whether it's about finding a fly or a hair in your soup, in which it was, whether it's about the status of messengers, whether it's about how you write a letter that includes a verse from the Torah, or whether it's about the differences between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, big differences in approaches between schools of thought about how we should live Jewishly. the Jewish conversation, says Gittin 6 and Eruvin 13, is a sacred one. And that means, unlike Rav Yosef, who was quick to dismiss Rav Evyatar for one reason or another, we ought to take the opinions of those we agree with and those that we disagree with equally seriously, attribute them both to the echo of God's revelation, and even maybe, as Beit Hillel does in the Eruvin story, spend equal time and maybe give headline privileges to those opinions that we disagree with. And maybe in that sense, we'll find the best path to bringing the most Torah into the world and the most shalom between ourselves and our neighbors. All right, I'm going to unshare my screen and come back. And
thank you. That is one of the most resonant phrases in Talmud, so it's nice to highlight it again. And nice to know that it was in this other location as well.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That's what the last piece I wanted to make before we open things up. I've studied a lot of Talmud before this journey through Daf Yomi, but, now through Daf Yomi, I'm studying more. I know this phrase from the story in Eruvin, which gets quoted by lots of people in lots of contexts. This is the first time, right, page 6, this week, encountering this page where I saw that it was quoted in another context. And were it not for Daf Yomi, quite possibly I would never have seen this particular phrase, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. And so now I'm hearing it a second time, and Daf Yomi allows us to encounter things in different contexts in different ways. I saw someone just put in the chat, the name came by too quick. I don't have my chat open right to say the Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai story. Maybe this comes up there too. The Elu ve'elu quote doesn't come up there too, but it does talk about differences of opinion. And there is a notion, that story does have something about checking in with Eliyahu and Avi about what God thinks about the debate in the Beit Midrash. So there is the Tanur Shel Achnai story echoes with this story as well, but we're going to see that later. I'm pretty sure that we haven't gotten to that in Daf Yomi, so I didn't want to do no spoilers.
It's in one of the Babas.
Right, it's coming, but I didn't want to. I know some people will know that story. It's quoted too. I left that for the Babas. We can revisit it when it comes. I went for the no spoilers, but we'll see other stories of Eliyahu weighing in.
Okay, and if some people on the call have no idea what the oven of Achnai story is, that's okay. We haven't gotten there, but it is also one of these very famous rabbinic stories. I think the most resonant line is when the rabbis outsmart God and God says something like, "My children have defeated me."
Oh yes, that's what Elijah.
That's one of the pieces. But it's a very rich, complicated story. We will make sure to take some time with it when we get there. In another year or two, something like that. It's
out there, but it's coming.
It's coming. Right. Rabbi Goldberg, you have a hand from Jerry.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Oh, we still can't hear you.
Try to unmute if you can.
Sorry.
I
just remembered the last chapter of Sota said that after the Chorban, God did not speak to Israel. We only heard from God through the Bat Kol. And here we have all these examples of God still speaking. So apparently, things are not as bad as the last chapter of Sota portrayed them after the Chorban, and I'm really happy to notice that.
That's interesting, right? There is in many stories we hear about an echo, God's voice echoes in the world, right through the Bat Kol. I would say, as I read this story today, the voice of God comes to us through Elijah, and Eliyahu has a little special status in that, right? God brings Elijah up to heaven, and the image is Elijah's hanging out there eternally with him, and so we have an on-the-spot reporter, right? Elijah comes back and reports. So it is indirect compared to if you think about God speaking to Moses. But I think that's a great question, and especially timely as the holiday of Shavuot is tonight, to think about how we hear God's voice in the world and through what channels. And I like that. Thanks, Jerry, for noting that.
Thank you.
I would say I agree with you also. The the darkness of that last chapter of Sota touched me in a way that sometimes rang familiar about tough times in the world, and sometimes said, well, maybe it's not that bad. There are moments for darkness and moments for light. And thanks for bringing, dimming the darkness and bringing up the light, Jerry. I see Carol, you have your hand up too. You want to unmute and weigh in, join in?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was really fascinating because it seems to touch on so much of Talmud. And my original question you actually answered in the very end, which was, with all the debates we have and competitions between different pairs of rabbis throughout the Talmud, how seriously should we take the lesson you taught us today? And I believe you said that is the bottom line. After every debate is said and argued, and or even the ones left with doubt, with teku, no resolution, the bottom line is that God hears both voices. So my question is, how do we know where the line is when we're involved in pages and pages of Talmud where the debates go on and on and on? How do we balance that with knowing that at the end of the day, both voices are valid? That's my question. It seems to embrace everything we're studying and in an important way. Thank you.
Sure. I think, that's a wonderful comment, right? There are times when the voices are going on and on and on in the Talmud, right? I think, for me, I know in these 3 years so far of Daf Yomi, there are times when I wish they would wrap it up and move on to the next topic. I hear that. I see some smiles of agreement with that experience. Right, the Talmud sometimes, right, it frames things as a debate, as a dialectic. This person says this, and here's the opposite. And let's go back and forth, and let's try to get to which one is right. And sometimes we can get drawn into one thing has to be right, and one thing, the other, that means the other thing is wrong. I think at least the way I operate is, while I aspire to know what God wants me to do to live a full Jewish life, I recognize that I'm not Elijah. I'm not the on the spot reporter. I can't ask. And I've made my own Jewish choices about how I'm going to live my life. But I'm not any more certain that my choices are right than your choices. And I think, we each follow the Jewish path that speaks to us or that we were raised in. We have strong opinions about some things and less strong opinions about others. But I believe that, especially in the places where we're with people who have strong opinions that are different about things, is that we have to hear the echo of God's voice in the other opinion, or it'll end the conversation. And, quick anecdote about that. Oh, I'm almost out of seconds, but I happened to this morning got up and I something came into my inbox that was an article from the Jewish media about a particular innovation that a particular Jewish movement made. And it was an interesting article reported. I'm going to leave the details out for right now because it's not about the issue itself. But I did what I shouldn't have done is I looked at there was one comment that someone had posted to this article online. And I looked at it, and I wish I hadn't. But the comment to the article online said, "Oh, well, this movement of Jews isn't legitimate, so it doesn't matter what they do." And it was painful for me to read. That was the voice. The person then said, like, "Okay, this is I wouldn't make that choice, and my movement doesn't make that choice, or it's different." But the person that was so dismissive, and what I heard in contrast, right? The person who wrote that comment did not hear the echo of God's voice, in the deliberation that the movement made to make a, decision that it made. And, even in the pages of the article that the reporter said as well. And it pained me that that's sometimes where our level of discourse is. And I'm, happier with spaces like this, that My Jewish Learning has convened where, we are Talmud interested people, right? I know from, interacting with you, many Jews and also many non-Jews who are here because they want to learn and study. And some of this conversation we're having and some of this learning is about hearing God's voice in the world and getting to know the rabbi's take on it. And it feels like that's a much more productive, happy, salvational space than when I saw it today. And, just seeing how this phrase, Elu Velu Divrei Chaim, was used in the second story that it appears in the Talmud, and the only other one I thought it was nice to call out today.
Yeah. And as we saw today, even the rabbis even listen, God even listens to the rabbis, right? And studies their texts. And a couple people commented on that in the chat. So I thought I'd highlight it and mention that that might remind some people of also what we saw way back in Brachot, the first tractate, where we see God putting on tefillin and praying, just like the rabbis, right?
Yeah.
We also had a really great, interesting comment on whether Babylonia displaces Eretz Yisrael. Do we want to take 1 minute to respond to that? Because that is an undercurrent in a lot of the Babylonian Talmud that sometimes we pick up in the essays and sometimes we don't. But it's a good way to look for is with the Jews now, with the center of Jewish learning shifting to Babylonia. There's some competition and tension between those communities.
Right. We see a lot of the tension. This recalls, for me, this conversation recalls for me the conversation at the end of Masechet Ketubot, where the rabbis in Babylonia are saying, we have a really good life here in Babylonia. Are we still obligated to move to Israel? As a Jew in the diaspora who has a pretty good life here, that resonated for me, saying I have a full Jewish life, but wait, am I supposed to live in Israel? And the question of, is Israel's status in this issue of get and writing a divorce, in Israel, the rabbis trust each other to write a divorce decree properly, so the messenger doesn't have to make the same decree. And the Babylonian rabbis are saying, hey, us too, we're just like you. We should have that same rule here. And the question is, are they equivalent status, or is Israel and it has a different status? And that we see that echo of it today. Besides the rivalry, also how to apply those rules. And sometimes the rabbis in Babylonia want to apply Israel rules to them, and sometimes the rabbis in Israel think that's inappropriate, and sometimes those rules flip. And we see that today about this matter, and we're going to see more of this issue of divorce overseas, delivery by messenger. It doesn't go away from any chapter, right? It's a recurring theme in Masechet Gittin because it makes for complicated scenarios. And then you deal with, partly country, where are they coming and from where are they going, and who are the people there and who are the authorities to them. That's a great theme. I'm glad people picked up on that for this week.
Amazing. Lots of rich stuff this week. I'm going to call it here because we're a little past time. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I hope you have a wonderful Shavuot. I brought my little visual for Shavuot today. This is the mural my Hebrew school students made after we studied the Midrash, which as far as I know is not in the Talmud, but it's found in Tanchuma and Shmot Rabbah and some other rabbinic midrashic collections that says it wasn't just the Israelites who stood at Sinai, it was all Jews of every era. So they drew themselves at the base of Mount Sinai receiving Torah. And so I hope you remember that as you celebrate Shavuot tonight too, that you too were at Sinai and you try to remember how it was and that you fully participated as well. And we're so glad for your participation here today too. And we will see you in this space next week and in your inbox tomorrow morning. I hope everyone has a really wonderful and meaningful Shavuot. Yeah.
Great to see you all. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Rachel.
And thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, as always. Really great text for today. Really great discussion, all of you. Thank you.
I just found them. The rabbis wrote them. It's all Talmud.
Well, you have a lot to choose from this week.
It's true.
All right.
It's true.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon.